Hello, everyone. So today I'm joined by Peter, also known as Expat. He is a very good friend of mine who, in my view, is one of the best minds in the realm of socionics. And I've learnt so much from knowing him over the years. Um, I thought it would be worthwhile us having a conversation about the empirical support, whatever it may be, for socionics as a theory and some of the ways of approaching it, because socionics is quite a complex thing. It is both a philosophy and a discipline, and it is something which, in my view, is aimed at being at least a pre-science, something which over time hopefully can become a fully qualified science in terms of having the methods of empirical research to support it. But yes, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Peter. Peter, hello. How are you
Hi,
today?
hello. I'm all right. Thank you very much.
Good. So, what I would say is I've been making use of ChatGPT for today. I thought I'd go on ChatGPT. I'd tell ChatGPT that it is an expert researcher of the scientific literature, and what I've asked it to do is to find what support there is for a number of different assumptions on which I think socionics is underpinned. Those assumptions, in sort of broad categories, are that first of all, the information metabolism elements, basically, to those who don't know, are the sort of the building blocks of socionics. They're the ways in which we subdivide the information that is presented to us, where different personality types vary in their ability to process or metabolize these different categories of information. So, what evidence is there that the information really is categorized? My suspicion is that it probably isn't, but we'll look into that in a bit. The second group of assumptions is around psychological asymmetry, the idea that people do vary in some sort of discrete way between their ability to process these different informational categories. For instance, if someone's very much inclined towards coming up with multiple possibilities, is very divergent in their thinking across the possibilities, that they'll have a lesser ability or even a lesser than baseline for them ability to maintain the details in their local environment. And the third group of assumptions would be around intertype relations, whether what socionics suggests about duality is something which is played out, does play out in empirical evidence about specifically diversity of strengths and also diversity of values. The hypothesis of duality, if boiled down to its most basic parts, is that maximal diversity of strengths and minimal diversity of values is what makes a good relationship or a mutually beneficial relationship or harmonious relationship. Just on those 3 points, Peter, do you have any thoughts? Do you think those are all things which could are like to be feasibly found in literature? Is there anything which you think probably won't be found in the literature?
I mean, I don't, depends on the literature, right?
Hmm.
Obviously, the information elements, as we use in socionics, they have been described in the socionics literature, right? Which, of
Hmm.
course, apart from what has been written more recently, but originally it was available in the, of course, the Eastern European literature. Of
Hmm.
course, there is a
Yes.
lot, right? But they were essentially they were registering the information, the concepts that were suggested by essentially two individuals, and that's what I want to comment regarding if they are assumptions or or predetermined or if they are in themselves based on empirical evidence. And I'll explain exactly what I mean. The two individuals that I'm talking about are, of course, Carl Jung and Augusta, Austro Augusta or Augusta or Aushre Augustin-Vinci. I mean, I have problem with her real name. And okay, Jung, he arrived at least the names of the information elements that we use, like introverted intuition, extroverted thinking, extroverted feeling, etc. He was the first proponent of such elements, although he didn't really apply them as the way that Socionics, that Aushre Augusta applied them. And I'm going to get, although of course, this creates a lot of confusion because people tend to assume that she started out from Jungian concepts and then developed a system, which is a bit different. She started out developing her system based on empirical evidence that she found, which I'm going to mention. And she then borrowed some concepts, borrowed or stole, or whatever you want to call it, some concepts from Jung, but she adapted Jung's concepts and definitions to her own purpose, and she changed it. So she wasn't a follower of Jung. She used him as a source, but she used him and his thinking and his concepts according to how she saw fit.
Yeah.
And going back, so the empirical evidence from Jung, of course, he arrived at his personality types, which he defined by what we now call information element as being dominant. He observed that in real people, which although he never said it explicitly, I think we have to assume that a lot of them were his patients, which would explain why, when he wrote his text on psychological types, or his description of the people who had those elements more dominant, they all seem a bit extreme. In particular, I suggest introverted intuition. But that was based on empirical information, in the sense that, okay, he was seeing evidence in real people. Unfortunately, I don't think he ever, to my knowledge, wrote down how many people he was sort of, how many people he was basing that formation. I mean, one has to assume, the assumption I would think is that he had, I don't know, hundreds of patients or more on his career, and that was a distillation of those, right? But unfortunately, I don't think he ever, to be nice if he had put it down on paper, but to my knowledge, he never did.
No.
But that was already a sort of empirical. Okay, that was how he observed in such people the preference for what we now would see as information elements. Now, but he was still attaching them to actual behavior of people, actually psychological preferences. Now, the way that Aushre did it later, she actually made it impersonal. She detached it from she, or certainly others, even more so, but she detached it from being necessarily how people for human beings, but she defined that, or she proposed a model where that was actually became a form of even describing reality. And in this case, my point now is that if you understand, for instance, let's say, I don't know, let's start with one, with introverted sensing versus and introverted intuition. That could be this is a just way of describing, for instance, that I can, if I am touching an object like this can of Coke, if I am feeling it's the metal, if I'm feeling how cold it is, and if I'm just focusing on it, and if I focus then on how the Coke tastes, I'm focusing on sensation. And this is something that is part of reality, right? We sense actual objects, temperature, etc. And if I, however, when focusing on holding the scan, I don't focus on the sensations. If I am focusing on what I did tomorrow, sorry, what I did yesterday, or what I'm going to do tomorrow, and my mind starts going into on its own directions, and I forget, so to speak, to focus on the actual sensations on the scan, then my mind has focused more on introverted intuition rather than introverted sensing.
Yeah.
Now, these are ways of these to call it introverted sense. So I don't think there is a question that these things exist, or the empirical
Mm.
evidence is just talking to any human being uh, that mind can go in these directions. The what is, so to call it introverted sensation or introverted intuition is just a way to define to this phenomena. So in this case, I would not say is pretend. I wouldn't say that I'm postulating that this exists
Mm.
uh, in a way that I could describe. Silly example. If I could postulate that a unicorn exists,
Yeah.
right? Let's prove that a unicorn really exists. What I'm doing what she did when she talked about all of these information elements, she was describing and just giving names to elements of reality that are observable. And she is defining them in a way. Maybe you could have find them in other different ways, but she wasn't really what she was doing. It wasn't really postulating the existence of anything. She was proposing a description or a model to describe uh, certain shapes of reality, right? And how we perceive and use this reality, right? In a way that can be put in, can be modeled, right? Now, and I don't think that I would call it more akin to a language, right? In any language is uh, is just a proposal how to describe things that really exist that can be very different, right? And of course, if you don't understand the language,
Yeah.
uh, it makes complete no sense. If you do understand it, then of course you can see, oh, it is there. It describes things that are real, right? So that's my take. So because you can describe information elements, certainly things like extroverted sensing, extroverted intuition, for instance, you can describe it uh, as separately from ecological types of human beings, right? So that is what that's my point. Right? I'd say the I don't think you have to be empirical about the existence of of the information elements. They are just a proposed model to describe
Yes.
observable reality. So that's what I would comment on what you said for a moment.
Yes, and I would certainly agree that when it comes to these information elements, there is an aspect of them where it's just obvious when you talk about it
Mm.
that these things are opposite. The more direct and confrontational you are, the less inclined you are to jump around the particular issue and consider the alternatives to taking the thing head on. The more emotive and expressive you are in your language and the conveying how you feel to others, the less matter of fact you are being.
Yeah,
The more logically impartial and consistent you are being, the less, well, partial and sentiment driven you are being in terms of which judgments you make about things. These are easily understandable as natural opposites, and
mm.
these are how the information metabolism elements have been framed.
Yeah,
There is, I think, a certain tendency in our culture now, one which is largely informed by positivism, where you almost cannot, you almost can't justify something unless you've put together some sort of factor analysis or some kind of study to show in reproducible laboratory conditions that that thing exists, even if it's as plain as the nose on one's face.
Yeah, I mean that's part of it, right? I mean, I don't know that we need to talk about that right now too much because it's a digression, but that's part of it.
Mm,
I think there is a, uh, I think part of these days people feel the need to do as you said, but I think in many cases, or maybe in modern society as well, it's more like about paying lip service to it than actually focusing on it, actually doing what you
mm,
described, right? So maybe if you are to mention this extroverted thinking, it would be an extroverted thinking role, right? Or rather than something that is really the main focus. But yes, I understand what you're saying.
yeah, and I think that's also another aspect of it, that in the paying of lip service, what someone end up doing in order to make the experiment feel more formal is they'll actually test something slightly different to the thing that actually is meant to be measured. I can use an example of the five-factor model, which is seen very much as a highly empirically supported way of understanding personality based on five key areas of traits. But if people apply that to scrutiny, they'll quickly realize that it rests on what's known as the lexical method, which are the words we use in our language.
Mm,
And they would run the words we use in our language through the exploratory factor analysis in
mm,
order to find these five clusters. So, really, what are being clustered are not the actual personality traits themselves, but the words that we use to describe those personality traits. And that can come up with certain problems, especially when we're not used to describing certain aspects of personality. And we're more inclined to describe the most visible and most visceral aspects of his personality traits. I think, for instance, in terms of introverted intuition, how it is quite ill treated by the five factor model because they have a dimension for openness to experience,
mm,
which is seen as loosely correlating to intuition, but
yeah,
it's very slanted towards extroverted intuition. And there
yeah,
isn't really anything to describe depth of insight into something without also talking about the openness, because I don't think people have the words to describe that as a personality trait.
yeah. But yes, but I mean, you're talking about Big Five and similar, right?
Mm,
Yeah, no, that's true. But the problem is really that introverted intuition is. I mean, once you get a concept, I think it's very clear. Like, but I think it's something very difficult to describe to a third party, right? Precisely because it is one of the more internal used elements. Another one is introverted feeling, right? It's difficult to it is difficult, more difficult to describe than openness, right? In the way that Big Five
mm,
describes, in a way that superficially you can describe introverted intuition. So I think in this case, it maybe is a necessary. I mean, I understand what you're saying, but it's difficult to be. And also, I mean, because it is something internal, although you can, of course, observe in others when they are in what they write, for instance, and how they behave, but it's something which is very difficult to put into words precisely because it is essentially a mental.
mm,
So I see what you're saying. It is an interesting concept. The Big Five, I guess, they went because the Big Five claims to be empirical and experimental, which is supposed to be the best for arriving at statistical data, for instance. They had to go for that which simpler to describe to others and to a third party and to describe and to put into writing if you and to invent some sort of objective criteria, although the criteria of course objective but based on potentially subjective understanding of words, as
Mm.
you what you
Yes.
said. But okay, okay, but there's only so much one can do, right? One can only hope that if you use several variations of the phrases and words, etc., in tests and such, that that the signal becomes stronger than the noise, right?
Yeah. Yes, I can certainly hope so about that. And I think that when it comes to information metabolism elements, yeah, we could design an experiment, but said experiment would similarly be leaning towards something other than the actual thing being measured. As the example you used of the Coke can
Yeah.
and drifting from thinking about the longer term or just more, can't say, sort of mental ramifications of what it means to be drinking a Coke can and how that has been borne out from centuries, no, millennia of first of all global interaction between different peoples, finding and sourcing different materials and putting together the processing chains to actually then have that Coke can be in your hand and containing a very fizzy liquid, and comparing that to, or just contrasting that with the experience of the tingling sensation of drinking it, and how clearly it's very hard to focus on both at the same time. It strikes me as very difficult to then find an operationalizable proxy
Although,
to measure.
not surprisingly, I think that you described constructing extroverted intuition with introverted sensing, while I was constructing introverted intuition, right? Because what
Mm.
I described was all starting from the potential contained in because all you said was limited to the can of Coke itself, while I was thinking that my mind would completely detach from the Coke and go into completely different directions,
Okay.
not
Yeah.
really and write. I mean, for writers, for instance, poets, they might start writing a poem, or writing a book in their minds, or a short story, which might not, which could be totally disconnected from the Coke, right? And what
Mm.
was still connected was a sort of extension on
Mm.
Coke, and what I said will divert from completely from it. Anyway,
So,
so just making clear for the from the point from this, just to have our definitions clear.
sure, fair enough. And I think that okay, it's very hard to sort of measure that. You could, what someone immediately think to do is to put someone in an fMRI and see what parts of the brain
Yes.
process this. Although that immediately leads to the issue: does it is it really a neurological separation, or is it a deeper metaphysical separation? The way it would read is that it's a metaphysical separation, but we would then experience that in a similar level of separation. Is that experience then neurological as opposed to metaphysical?
Yeah. I mean, whether this could be measured as you suggested, and what anybody would see from that. Now, of course, I don't know. That would be a direct empirical measurement to see if what happens to the brain when focusing on different information elements, of course, right? That would be a direct empirical, but that's of course that would start, of course, that would be a validation. But no, actually, no, I don't think that actually uh, I don't think necessarily would. I don't think such an experiment is needed to describe the because this way I don't think the information elements need to be proven to exist, because in themselves, as I said, they're more akin to a language. We're describing things. I think the brain bit
Mm.
or the MRI bit to be whether really my brain you can detect whether, as I said, if I'm focusing on the sensations taste, and touch, etc., or whether I completely disconnected from it and I am just my mind is just going a completely different direction. Actually, I was just thinking that an application of this, if you could detect what the brain is doing, it could be a way to describe whether, for instance, a driver or a pilot is essentially getting distracted, right? So the moment that, if it could be detected, the moment that if we can have a sort of Elon Musk kind of chip in the brain, the
Yeah.
moment a pilot stops paying attention or focusing on the actual task of flying, if it starts thinking about the fight that he had with his girlfriend last night, then a buzz would come, would say, "Stop thinking about that. Think about about what your
Yeah.
physical sensations are actually
Yes.
doing." That would be an application if that could ever be done. But
Mm.
that again, that's a separate issue from the existence. I think that this what you described to be an empirical measurement of how the brain behaves if it is focusing on an information element or the other. Like, for instance, talking about language, right?
Mm.
And again, maybe people who know neuroscience can already know that exists. Because, for instance, I speak several languages,
Mm.
as you know, and one could say that, okay, uh, if I am reading or watching a movie in English, if that if in my brain which could be measured, if I would then start reading or or watching a movie in German, whether that would show up as using different parts of the brain, right? But
Mm.
that would have, but whether this could be showed or not, whether it would just say in the MRI, okay, no, it's just reading or watching a movie. It doesn't really make a distinction between using language A or language B. But whether this could be measured or not, that to validate that the brain is doing that, but that would not be have nothing to do with the existence of the languages, right? Which were
Yes.
are
Yes.
models for conveying information. It's not exactly the same thing. So that's what.
Mm.
So that's a bit of a difference. Now, uh, so I just want to I just pay a bit pedantic because you said that
Sure.
the elements might be predetermined. Yeah, they're predetermined, but they are not like, as I said, postulating that unicorns or leprechauns exist. Or the Sasquatch or whatever. Let's then
Yeah.
find out whether they do exist. No, it is a proposed model based on observable reality.
Yes. And I think that certainly, as you say, the example of someone driving, if someone is not paying attention, if someone's thinking of something other than what's on the road, then they're not paying attention to what's on the road.
Yeah.
That is very obvious to people, and
Yes.
it's very much in common parlance and common understanding. Um, and I think what one would be drawn to do is to try and find the proof in the brain, which is almost like the black box. You
Yes.
could the concepts are clearly delineated. The behaviors and how people are functionally are clearly delineated. The brain may be totally different, and it may end up being a mystery trying to go and look at the brain. I have done a little bit. As I said before, using ChatGPT, I have asked it to have a look at some of this, and it has been relatively forthcoming. If I were to share my screen now,
Okay.
I asked it, are concrete and abstract information truly distinct? And its verdict is that that is actually partly supported. I didn't ask it, by the way, to look at the brain. It just did it because
Mm.
I think that's, yeah, if you want to understand, because you can't go to the metaphysics empirically, you have to go to something next to it, and they it seems to assume already it must be in terms of neuroimaging. So what they found was that there are robust differences, both behaviorally and neurologically, in the processing of the concrete and the abstract. Um, but they also aren't cleanly separate. They do overlap, at least in the brain. I remember
Mm,
talking to Rita about some of Dario Nardi's research and how she was skeptical about um, clear, distinct patterns being shown in different parts of the brain to quite a degree, which had been suggested by um, some of the diagrams which we found in some of his work. But I think there's a similar issue here where because the brain is so complex, it is really hard to say that this is the brain for thinking about ideas and that's the brain for thinking
mm,
about concrete
yeah.
things, despite the fact that it does show up quite distinctly in people's behavior.
Mm,
Nevertheless, it does say treating concrete versus abstract as functionally dissociable is actually a defensible position according to literature, but they're not fully separable models. I'm
but,
happy to take that.
mm, yeah, I mean, I confess my knowledge of of empirical neuroscience is limited to see maybe I'm out of date. Maybe a lot of has been discovered in this area,
Mm.
so that'd be something to check, or maybe checking ChatGPT to see what's been done in this, whether experiments, as we just talked about, have been made or not.
Well, there's in terms of more recent experiments, the most recent one they have here is from 2021, in Nature, in Nature Journal, which I haven't looked into yet. But I have asked it for peer-reviewed journals rather than anything which falls short of it.
Yeah.
And they did find a double dissociation between abstract and concrete concepts, which is that they are processed by at least partly different networks in the brain. But the neuroimaging data it is not in line with neuropsychological reports. Led to assume that means that when it comes to neuropsychological, it's got perhaps more to do with let me see, conscious literature. It's just a temporal anterior involvement. Okay, so there's a literature on the matter from imagine past experiments, and then there's simply the neuroimaging, and there is perhaps not quite the alignment which they were expecting, but there is still dissociation in both.
Mm, right.
That's the thing; it always gets more complicated than simple with the brain, which I think is the difficulty because it's so complex. It's evolved over many hundreds of millions of years,
Yeah.
and of course it's going to be difficult to really pass out compared to what behaviors are, which are very much modulated by necessity. Um,
Yeah, by necessity, but also by something more internal, which is why observing in types, of course. Although, of course, we that's one of the things we don't know exactly.
yeah.
We and actually, can I go to the empirical, because I talked about how Jung original observation of
Mm,
those patients led to postulating what came the origin of certainly the seed that eventually became converted in led to the understanding of the information elements. If I
mm,
refer to the empirical observations that Austria herself did,
yes.
because the other point then is okay, whether one is the empirical observation of information elements, and we talked about something. Another one is the empirical observation of personality types, and also, and that of course was where socionics in itself came, is really how they affect interpersonal relationships, how people interact, which of course is something that Jung that didn't even try to
No.
get into, because of course he was analyzing people as individuals. He was not analyzing how people interact, and uh, I mean he may have mentioned something about that in his personality types paper, but certainly it wasn't the core of it. And in the case of what led, I find it fascinating because this is something that could only be observed in the specific conditions of the Soviet Union, and maybe more particularly the Soviet Union of in the 60s or 70s when she investigated it. Because I mean, you know this, but just for the people who don't know, her job actually in the Soviet Union, she was she was part of a mix of social worker with statistical analysis for economics, something of the sort. And part of her job meant interviewing vast numbers of people and also couples living in their flats. And she found that couples that as individuals, they seemed very similar to other couples, but their interactions varied a lot, or how happy they were, or the sense of comfort. You could could have a young Russian couple. The young man and the young woman, they would be very similar to another young man and a woman that she met in another situation. But while one couple would be extremely unhappy and depressed about their relationship, the other one would be blissfully happy. And she couldn't understand because as individuals, they seemed very similar. And she was trying to understand why exactly, what's causing this wild discrepancy between their psychological level of comfort with one another. And when I say this could only be done, actually, let me go back. Actually, of course, what she observed, of course, in socionics is she was seeing the extremes of duality and of conflict relationships, and duality, of course, and dual and conflict couples. They are, of course, they can be quasi-identicals, right? So if you have I mean, I think you prefer to say ENTJ rather than LIE, right?
I honestly don't mind. I guess for the more MBTI oriented audience, yes, the ENTJ would be the quasi-identical of the ENTP.
Yeah, okay.
And yeah,
Okay. For
so
instance, what she observed was, for instance, ENTJ ISFJ couple, which would be duals,
yeah,
they would look very similar to an ENTJ ISFP couple because the ISFJ and ISP would be very similar superficially, but their relationships would change from conflict to duality,
right.
and of course, and she then observed the different levels of relationships going back from duality and conflict, which are the more obvious ones because they are extremes and are similar to all of the others in between. Now that was empirical observation because she was observing real people in these situations, and the reason why this could only be happen, I think the only probably the only, I mean, maybe not, but I would, as far as I know, it could only have been done in the Soviet Union in that period, simply because it eliminates all of the, or it certainly reduces the noise of other factors apart from the socionics one, because at the time what happened during the socialist system, communism, what would happen was that a couple, a young man, a young woman, they were living with their parents, for instance, say, and they would not very, unless they were part of the ruling elite, in not very large apartments. So they would like to get married, and they will be given or assigned their
Yes.
their apartment by the state. And okay, so a 20-year-old, two 20-year-olds, they would marry, and they'll marry because they love each other, they want to get married. The state would assign them an apartment, and they would then move there. Now, of course, according to the ideology of the time, if you come from similar levels of education and similar social class levels, and without any and similar culture background, because it was all in the same culture. And if you like each other, because if you didn't, you do not get married in the first place, then as far as the state is concerned, there was no real reason for you to feel miserable 2 years later and want to separate. Now,
Yeah.
of course, you know that in real life, that's not what happened. But in
No.
that particular case, they were trapped because they would not be, they could not just move to another apartment in a free market system. They would basically be stuck together. Um, and that's why Austria could observe this effect. Of course,
Incredible. Yeah.
in today's, in a Western society today, or
Yeah.
even presumably even in the former Soviet Union today, that wouldn't happen because, yeah, after if the couple is feeling unhappy, they'll just split, right?
Yes.
And we'll try to find a place to stay elsewhere. So this maybe today people do that too quickly, but that's another discussion altogether. And because they were forced to stay together, and the and there were no other objective reasons for people to, after some time, to suddenly to feel unhappy. There are only psychological reasons. That's the point, right?
Yeah.
There are not societal reasons or class issues reasons, or that the Soviet state to recognize as valid. There are only personal, psychological reasons,
Yes. Yes.
which they would and which they would say, okay, but if you decide to get married, it's because you do know each other and you like
Yep.
each other. So what's changed? Well, what's changed, of course, is that the kind of intertype relationships, the kind of interaction, sometimes they only become visible after some time.
Yes.
Certainly with things like benefit and illusion and all
Yeah.
of that. But the
Yeah.
empirical evidence that, so because she started from observing real people, and I don't know the numbers, but I know that she must have observed hundreds of people in this situation.
Yes.
That was empirical evidence for people having preferences, different preferences on using the information elements, and how that affect the relationships with other people who have very different, or very different, or very different but supplementary preferences, right? So that was I would say that was a valid form of empirical information. Now, the problem is that the
Mm.
empirical research that she did, which led to the to postulate that they worked in the way that socionics theory operates, that certainly was, I would say, I mean, that the problem is very different to reproduce these days, precisely because societies are not reproducing the situation. But that was already an empirical, just like Jung's observation of his patients to detect in individuals differences on for focusing on specific information elements, even and just like she observed how the different focuses will affect interpersonal relationships. That was empirical as a concept. Now, what, of course, the precise existence of the precise types, as she described, or maybe, or the quadrants, or the modeling part of it, right? That is what is much more difficult
Yes.
to validate empirically, right? The the bare existence of it as reflecting something that is based on real observations, it is something, but uh, the empirical validation of the specifics of the model, that is something much more difficult, and I don't think we have it.
Yep. I think that very much lines up with what ChatGPT has also been able to show me. I say that because I kind of preempted it because I already had done some of the research into this part, the intertype relationships. If I were to scroll down to looking at these two things, which is first of all, do people with diverse values work poorly together, and do people with diverse strengths and expertise work well together? This is the part which is most congruent with intertype relationships.
Mm,
If we look into the understanding of duals, we
yeah.
know that they're both very, very different, but also they're similar in a very key way. Duals are very different in terms of their strengths, how they naturally process different sorts of information with different levels of confidence. What one dual is, what one dual in the dyad is very confident at, the other will be less confident at, and vice versa. So this is point five. It is conditionally supported that functional and cognitive diversity enhances creativity, innovation, complex problem solving when the team has enabling conditions such as psychological safety, good information, elaboration, and aligned goals. It's interesting that without that alignment, the effects are actually quite small. But I was looking also elsewhere in the literature, and when other things are controlled for, yes, you do want greater informational, or I would say strengths diversity. If a
Mm,
team is able to cover different things, then the team is more robust because you have someone who's good at you have a decent person for any task that comes its way. But yes, the psychological safety, how okay people feel around each other, helps moderate that. But that then leads me to part four, which is do people with diverse values work poorly together? Often, yes, unless it's managed. Unless there is bridging between people, then yes, if people have do not have value congruence, if they are misaligned in what their priorities are, what they want from their working together, then that's going to cause people to have fault lines, leading to more conflict, worse team processes, and of course, no psychological safety. You're not going to have psychological safety if someone has totally different priorities to you in terms of what they want to get out of working together. So when you have alignment in values and you have very differing strengths, that's the ideal outcome for a team working together.
uh,
That's a very similar mapping to very same configuration to duality.
okay, but what exactly do you know? What exactly they are talking about when they say values?
Well, that is the harder part because they would not have defined the values according to
Yeah.
the way Socionics understands it. If they were to try, they're in the same way that the Big Five has a factor analysis driven understanding of personality traits. There is a factor analysis driven understanding of different sorts of values, and those values do map relatively well to Socionics. So there's a power motivation, there's an achievement motivation, there's it's a harmony or unity motivation, there's a compassion motivation. Most of them are kind of covered. There's a novelty or new experiences motivation, so or even hedonism or pleasure motivation. So they are mappable. They're not totally alien to how we understand values in terms of socionics, and they would have used something like this in a large number of the studies.
Yeah, I mean, okay, this is something which this kind of, as far as work is concerned, this is something that I think needs to be uh, very, yeah, I think I think has to be done very specifically because
Mm.
obviously, right. Of course, I mean, look at some basic. I mean, talking from personal experience, right? At some basic level, uh, there is a values, for instance. If people are working together, really, the cost. I mean, there's a difference whether people are working to. For instance, I work together with people, but uh, via email and via phone mainly, and via accomplishing things together from a distance, right? Then in
Yeah.
this case, the scope for this kind of conflict of as long as people are doing their minimal job that's expected, then of course the scope for values conflicts is much less. Now, if people are working together physically and very closely, right, literally working together in an office and having to depend on each other for tasks on a daily basis,
Yes.
then there is something else. Also, because in this case, even something as silly as or maybe not as silly, as simple as people working together, and if there are these difficulties, uh, some people who feel discouraged, they just want to be popped up by people saying, no, no, we're going to manage, we're going to make it, we're going to to do all right, we're going to uh, to succeed, and they don't like to hear the one person who keeps pointing out the cautioning against, no, okay, but we still have to do that, we have to, can't forget that, okay, this may still go wrong.
Yep.
And that's one of the clashes, because obviously the person doing that is only trying to make sure people are not going to overlook or forget a few things in order to accomplish the goal. But this kind of person is obviously, not obviously, sorry, is often perceived by others. Oh, this person is too negative, right?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
I can't work this guy. He's too negative. While, of course, all that he's doing is to make sure that if he thinks that people are not keeping their minds on that, he points out, okay, but let's not forget about this. This key can still go wrong. We have to be careful. And that's a typical socionics clash. And that, of course, now, of course, but I don't know if these will be uh, the kind of values that this article is values clash that this article is talking about, right? Uh, because at some level, right, the values in terms of, I don't know, politics, that's easy, right? It's just people don't have to talk about politics at work, right? Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. No, very, very, very much agreed. People can, yes, political values. There could be some sort of leaning, some sort of skew, but it's certainly not absolute. But no, I'd say more in line with things like competence versus social mood and
mm,
harmony, positive
yes,
expression,
yes,
um, openness to new ideas versus
yes.
desire to focus on a few outcomes and not get distracted. Um, Someone who's quite assertive and intense versus someone versus go at a very leisurely pace.
Yeah, no, that's
These kinds of things, I'd say, are values
no,
in
that
this context.
definitely. No,
Yes,
that of course is also of course related to socionics as well. No, definitely, right?
yes,
uh, the whole idea whether it's more important to, I mean, whether it is more important to keep an harmonious environment rather than maybe, even if at the cost maybe of accomplishing things in the most quickest and effective way, or vice versa. No,
yes,
that's certainly one example of this. But that kind of stuff is also explained by socionics, of course,
yes,
but unless we are really observing specifics, uh, is not really a empirical validation. Yeah, the specifics
mm,
can an empirical validation of it, of course, but
yes. Of course, I wasn't, of course, I can't be certain that across these various studies that there would be discipline over exactly what kinds of values they're talking about, but more if taken in aggregation. The studies tend to say that values diversity is a negative thing when whenever someone ever talks about diversity there's a strong bias towards trying to describe it as a positive. So when I did find articles saying that values diversity actually had a negative effect, especially when you had two different sets of values which are at loggerheads and they almost split the team, that to me was very much signal in the noise. And it was and it was not only was it something which made me think, okay, there are kinds of diversity which aren't so good. But specifically, it made me think, okay, this is where intertype relations, as mapped out by socionics, can be so potent.
Yeah, actually, it just occurred to me that if these articles, if these articles are based or are supported by, for instance, right, like a graduate student is
Mm,
some time in an actual office and actually writing down for a thesis the specifics of such value, confront values, right? But then giving the specifics, right? Like for
yeah,
instance, and then the problem arose because John was too intense pushing for results, while that disturbed Mark because he was more focused on being on harmonious, and he felt this constant push for constant push for results is stressful, etc. No, I
yeah,
mean, if there was I have to assume that these days, when so many people working in so many fields, there may well be this kind of work, right, where something is very or some very detailed, and that would be direct empirical information of this kind of socionic concepts. But actually, I'm not sure how, even if they do exist, I'm not sure how we could find them.
yeah. We need to put together studies specifically around those sorts of things, and we'd also would need. This is the problem with business psychology. It's very hard to get a controlled environment. This is
Yes,
why, as you say, the Soviet created homogeneity
yes,
and a sort of almost a forcing to stick together quality.
yeah,
And both those things created the ideal environment for good quality case studies. Which is why Austra was very privileged in terms of the information available to her, which we don't have today. I think it's a
yeah,
fascinating point that you make, Peter.
yeah. And of course, right? Uh, but regarding the, I would say something about all of this.
Hmm.
It is that it may be very difficult to achieve empirical validation in a way that would satisfy strict uh, and a strict, let's say, and certainly not a, and a strict and a strict scrutiny, right,
Hmm.
to have confirmation, proof, etc., of specific cases, right. However, um, if okay, I'll go into I'll make an analogy, which maybe is not is a bit stretching as an analogy, but maybe it's hopefully
Hmm.
it helps as illustration.
Sure.
Because I mentioned languages, right? Okay, so information elements, to say that something is worth thinking versus worth feeling, etc. In a way, this is just ways to describe real things that you can recognize.
Yes.
And I was wondering, for instance, if an analogy could be made with discovering an ancient language.
Hmm.
Like, for instance, when people deciphered the Egyptian inscriptions, right? The Egyptian hieroglyphs.
Yeah.
Uh, Obviously, right? Or any other ancient language, like ancient.
Cuneiform.
Sorry?
Cuneiform.
Yeah, cuneiforms. Um, until, of course, somebody deciphered them. Obviously, you could stare into them, and they would make no sense whatsoever. If they could just be random, right?
Yeah.
And if I, who cannot, unfortunately, cannot read cuneiform from Babylonia or from Persia, unfortunately, but if somebody who can stands there and reads it from me, I have to take at face value that they can read it, and they are telling me, or they're reading, rather than just telling me nonsense about it, right?
Mm.
But the point I'm making is that even if, when an ancient language is rediscovered, when it is rediscovered, you don't have to have any living speaker of the language to tell you, okay, this is what the language means. No, because the moment that the language is put together, is deciphered, everything written in that language makes sense, right? Just like, just like when you first learn to read even modern languages, right? Of course, when you first, until you learn to read, letters make no sense. Once you learn to read, they make sense because they're obvious that they make sense. You understand what they're saying.
Yeah.
And the point I'm making is that uh, for in socionics types and interactions, when you have observed them a lot and studied these concepts, a time comes when you can see them. You can see them operating. You can not only the concepts of introverted thinking, introverted feeling, etc., but because they click together, and
Yes.
once you've seen it, you cannot unsee it, right?
Yes.
However, it is, but this becomes a sort of personal, becomes a sort of personal validation, which is difficult to transmit to people.
Yes.
Somebody who hasn't, just like if I have learned cuneiform, it's difficult to. I mean, I can of course translate it to somebody else, but I cannot transmit the actual experience until.
Yes.
And of course, then it's up to the person whether they want to trust that I am actually reading cuneiform or whether I just telling them a lot of
Yeah.
nonsense,
Yeah.
right? This was maybe it was a slightly. I just making this point because what I'm trying to say with this example is that it may well be beyond the realms of practicality to actually validate socionics in terms of the information elements and in terms of their effects on human interactions, and of course whether how exactly the relationships of duality, conflict, etc., operate in a way that it will make obvious sense to everybody. However, once you actually spend time observing this, it is clear that there is something that there is something to it. Although outsiders can only say, okay, but this is just it is just a subjective impression, right? And of course,
Yeah.
it becomes very difficult to. It's difficult to make this point.
But here's the thing. We could say a similar thing about a religion. You have to, or even, not even quite a religion. If we were to talk, for instance, about Scientology, where you have to really get in deep to really start to see the value of Scientology, and it starts to click, and you start to uncover these deep
Well,
insights.
I mean, look, I don't know. I don't know that science is a good analogy, to be honest. If I may say so. I
I'm
mean,
using it because of its sketchiness, but yes.
okay, because um, look, I never really got into reading Scientology. I
Yeah.
do know that its original book, Dianetics, made some claims which
Yes.
are logical, right?
Yes.
Which is about how you can uh, purge bad experiences from
Yes.
so that they are not going to haunt you, etc. And something like that in itself. These of course has nothing to do with socionics. I just want to make clear
No.
to
No.
everybody who is listening, there's nothing to do with socionics.
Yep.
I make the point that of course one could argue that some people could say, "Oh, for me it has worked." In this case, it's difficult to argue, but then this is something. But I would argue that it's different because it is something personal. You could argue going back to religion, right? Look, I really don't like the comparison of socionics to religion or Scientology, right? But let's
Sure.
I'll mention that maybe just to make a distinction. I think somebody has written that, for instance, that if you get the people, maybe the guy who discovered the genome, right? I don't remember his name now. That
You mean Crick?
I don't remember. Sorry, but, that he had a vision of God or of the Trinity by observing. I quote from memory, right? But he had it doesn't matter because it doesn't matter if it was real or to whom it applied. That he had a vision of of uh, of the Trinity by observing how some sort of ice formations came together, right? And that sort of clicked in his mind. Oh, that makes me think of the Trinity. Now, a lot of the old style of the original saints, right? People like St. Paul, etc. They had this kind of revelations. Now, when you talk about religion, if you have a vision or if you know that
Yeah.
the Trinity is correct by observing how ice melts together, that, of course, some people would say that's a religious experience,
Yes.
which is very true for the person involved.
Yep.
But it doesn't mean anything about being true in the objective way or in
Sure.
ways can convey to somebody else. I would say, using from Socionics' point of view, that this kind of stuff is a manifestation of introverted intuition,
Yes.
right? Uh, which is very personal and it may be completely real for the personal for the person, and a religious experience of this kind would be one manifestation of this kind of introverted intuition. Jung described, given an example, somebody said a patient kept saying that, oh, there is a snake in my stomach, right?
Yes.
It's
Yes.
a kind of experience. Now, uh, for an individual, the religious experience, how can anybody say that the religious experience wasn't real, right?
Yep.
But we can say that the woman certainly did not have a snake in her stomach, right?
Yes.
So,
Yes.
but even though they will be experiences which are very internal and not validated by external reality, in the case of, since you mentioned Scientology, maybe for some people, Dianetics Dianetics techniques, etc. For some people, they will think, okay, that they get something from it. I don't know. But however, if you're talking about Scientology, uh, and now I don't know if I'm annoying people who like Scientology or people who don't like it, but in Scientology, of course, makes all the claims. It has its own mythology of I don't know, of ancient, etc.
Ancient
Right?
aliens, yeah.
Sorry.
But of sort of ancient aliens as sort of us being Thetans who are trapped inside it's actually very Gnostic in many of its origins, the idea that we are trapped in some sort of physical body and we have to be relieved from that by some
Yeah, and
it's very
these,
Gnostic.
and these, of course, and these, of course, are and that's of course these, of course,
Mm.
are just claims without any basis on objective reality,
Yeah.
unless people can prove otherwise.
Mm.
But this is, of course, something different from socionics, which is something which is based and can be seen in observable reality. And as you know, right, when we type people, we may not agree with specifics, but we will agree on the reasons why we are typing a person as type
Yes.
B, and normally we get very close to it. So
Yes.
it's not entirely internal, right?
Sure.
It's
Sure.
already based on external reality, which is why it is possible to discuss it and to observe this phenomena in a way that other people can understand and see.
Yeah.
That's a very different concept from whether Dianetics or whether having a religious experience by observing some isolation, which is totally personal and internal.
I would therefore move to a closer analogy. I remember seeing an old video on YouTube of a different typology community.
Mm-hmm.
Although it included someone who spent time as part of our diagnostics team. Um, this is the old sort of pod layer videos. I saw one video with I think can't remember his name, the coach, the person who sort of led this sort of movement, which was sort of the most sort of culty and almost Scientology-like of the different typology movements. Mitchell Newman was who's now famously gone to Model G and the School of Humanitarian Socionics. He was part of that group of people typing others using the pod layer technique, looking at warm wizard hands and all these other sorts of cues which they use to then work out someone's type, whether they're knee shy or shy knee. And I saw looking on their faces the wonder and the sense of yes, this is all clicking. We have found the truth, and they're sort of doing it almost in unison. And it makes me reflect on what we do. I think, are we just playing a more sort of toned down and more sophisticated version of that same group game? Have we also discovered very much a sort of a shared language between ourselves, but a language which no more is no more congruent with reality and no more internally coherent than what they were doing?
Okay, I don't know about what they are doing, right?
Fair.
I don't remember the story, to be honest. Um, I would say I just repeat what I said, right? I mean, the the concepts of socionics that we discussed
Mm,
can be discussed and then can be described in ways that other people can see, which is, I guess, is why many people are watching this.
mm,
Is not purely so is not actually one of the things that I have always been trying to focus on, precisely to make sure that we're discussing things which are as close to direct observation as possible, rather than go into way to abstract things that cannot be validated, or at least begin to be validated. I think there's one question. I think there's a difference, right? For instance,
mm,
going back to our discussion, from a practicality, from a practical or from an engineering perspective, so to speak, right? Direct validation of socionics is difficult. However, we pointed out to ways of how it could be done, right? Whether it is observing how the brain operates, or replicating the kind of work, the original work that Austra Augusta did. This kind of so it is possible to put together ways of validating socionics types and relationships the way that we've been discussing.
mm.
It may not be practical to do it, certainly not with the resources of a university or a state institution, etc., or a big company,
Mm.
right? Um, um, who knows? Look, for instance, maybe big institutions who have many people working together, whether it is the U.S. Armed Forces or the
Mm.
NHS, right?
Yes.
Maybe if they really wanted to put together a project to validate socionics, they would have the resources and the critical mass of people working to analyze that. Of
Mm.
course, but it's not but it's a question of somebody really wanting to do it and have the resources to do it. But the path is there. in some of this other stuff, I don't know that it is possible to validate it empirically, even as a concept. You see what I mean?
I I think so. I think that when it comes to again, you could test the practicalities of sociologics. I think this has already been done to some degree. If I'm just looking in on ChatGPT just to remind me, I mean, first of all, there's a whole body of journals, of articles written in journals, largely by Bukolov and his mentology,
Mm,
sociologics and mentology, which I get the key issue with that is that although it's peer reviewed, it's not independently peer reviewed
mm,
because he owns the journals in which his own work and those of his friends are being looked at. And
yeah.
but there have been attempts. I think Carol Pietrak has actually. Let me look at this. He's done a review of a model. I think it's been used for teams on aeroplanes.
Ah,
Yes, if I recall, it was used for I think flight stewards.
mm,
Let me just check to see if Wikipedia has any recollection of it.
okay.
Okay, well, ChatGPT couldn't find it. I remember finding it. There are anecdotal reports of airlines in the 1990s to 2000s experimenting with sociolinks typing for cabin crew selection and team compatibility. Bukolov and Karpenko mention applications of sociolinks in staffing large organizations, including aviation companies, in their writings. But they're not. This is the problem. They're not published in peer-reviewed journals. So there has been attempts at putting things into empirical practice and gathering, the validation, but it's just not rigorous, which I think is the problem with, not a problem with the culture of Ukraine or the culture of Russia, but
Yeah.
with the culture of a particular socionists in those countries and how they think they can be a bit fast and loose with calling something a science.
Yeah, I have to say as well, right, that um, accepting, of course, that I may not be, that I'm definitely not aware of everything that was discussed in
Hmm.
Socionics, but when I spend time reading the original, I haven't done it in a lot of time, but when I spent a lot of time reading the original papers made in Russia and in Ukraine, um, what I concluded was that apart from the original work from Augusta, which, as I said, was arrived at a model
Yeah.
starting from empirical information, validation of it wasn't really. There's a lot of work trying to refine the model or define terms, but validation of it wasn't that much of a priority in terms of observing
Yeah.
real people. It was more about actually, um, I mean, even the a part of socionics that I'm personally now these days skeptical about, which are the reigning dichotomies.
Mm.
They started out as a proposition, as a mathematical possibility
Yes.
based on the four original dichotomies uh, already present in the original 16 types. But having arrived at the reigning dichotomies as a proposition, uh, there wasn't really much or of any work trying to see how they reflect real people, right? They just said, okay, this must be this. I think this exists, but I never saw. At some point, I really was interested, and I really tried to find it, but I couldn't find it.
Yeah.
So I don't think that uh, the the bit in the Russian and Ukrainian socionics in the classical days that I thought was most uh, that was made it possible, I would say, to arrive at some sort of objective reality reference point, right? Was that there was a lot of work typing not only historical figures, but
Yep.
figures of literature.
Yes.
And of course, even though,
Gone with the wind.
of course, literature is fictional, but if everybody says that, for instance, in the Three Musketeers, D'Artagnan was an ENTP, then that leads, since everybody can read the book about describing what kind of a person D'Artagnan was supposed to be, it gives people a starting point. Oh, okay, but that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about. So it does anchor it in fixed reference points that can be understood from person to person, and that is at least provides the tools to go for basically saying, okay, now we know what that when you're talking about ENTPs, we are talking about specific kinds of persons, right?
Yeah.
Rather than just is a person that uses extroverted intuition and extroverted introverted logic.
Yes.
But what does that mean exactly,
Yes.
right? So
It wasn't validation. It was trying to articulate the theory using examples, using commonly accepted pictures of those people.
yeah,
Yes.
exactly. But that already grounds it into a
Yes.
common reality, right?
Yes.
Although a lot of other sometimes models, they just go into which are more introverted thinking based. I mean, as I think
Mm.
which you would find more interesting than I, for
Yep.
instance.
Yep.
That makes more difficult because people will assume that everybody is talking about the same thing, but maybe not really.
Yep. Because there isn't the qualia. When it dives into introverted logic, it's just a series of semantics. There's no
Yes.
qualia, but this is this is what I see, and that's what you see. And I think that's I think that when we have a number of different communities, we have the objective personality is another one where they use their coins to type people, and they all and after a while there is convergence. They can all see the same coins in the person, and they've all, I think, locked around the same qualia. But then the question is that qualia salient and important, or have they just settled around any qualia that they can find? And reliably determine, is that quality actually going to tell you something important about the personality itself? And I think this is where there needs to be a method of determining the relative value of different typology systems and next to each other in terms of their explanatory power, their internal consistency, as well as the reduction of superfluousness.
Yeah. Yes. But you said explanatory power and what else? Sorry.
Well, the way I layer it, so I'd say that internal consistency needs to come first.
Yes.
Um, then it's explanatory power. And then with both of them being the same, um, the removing of superfluousness.
Yeah, but I'll add something else, right? This is very interesting. I'll add something else
Mm.
because there is a typology system which used to be very popular. I don't know if it still is because I
Mm.
haven't with for a while, but I looked into it a lot at a time, and I thought that it had a lot of internal consistency and
Mhm.
a lot of explanatory power, and yet, in relation to socionics, in comparison to socionics, it was very flawed. You know what I'm talking about?
Psyche yoga?
Huh?
Are you talking about psyche yoga
And I don't even know what it is.
or Enneagram?
Enneagram.
Enneagram, okay.
Talking
Yes.
about Enneagram. And the
Yeah.
Enneagram, right? Uh, and it, I've a lot of its descriptions are very deep. Some of their insights about how types are affected if they are stressed or not. Uh,
Yes.
a lot, and some of the description of types are very deep and they resonate with people because people can identify. And however, it is it doesn't. Its flaw is that it can't explain uh, real human beings as completely as socionics, simply because the socionics types, they do cover, I mean, however imperfectly as any modelist, they do cover the whole range of human human types.
Mm.
Um, and the Enneagram has a blind spot related to extroverted thinking types,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Which is also a flaw in the original MBTI as it was first proposed. They don't
Yes.
really, they didn't really. I think the obvious reason for that is that they were both put together by people who did not value extroverted thinking. And this is really very obvious in the Enneagram. And I think that the Enneagram describes very well some socionic types and some variations of types,
Yes.
but it has a big blind spot. And of course, the practical effect of it, of course, is that people who really get into the Enneagram, uh, they are not, they might understand very well the individuals who are described by it, but they are not going to, but they are going to completely be oblivious
Yep.
to the existence of,
Yes.
in particular, of extroverted thinkers, right?
Yes.
And the point I'm making is that a system can be, as I said, internally coherent and be uh, uh, what was the other definition said?
Internally coherent and have explanatory power. But
Power.
but I think that explanatory power is scalar. You don't either have explanatory or you don't. It's how much explanatory
Yeah,
power,
yeah,
and those with
of
more
course. But
without. Yes.
sorry, but
Yeah.
the Enneagram does have a lot of that, and
Yeah.
yet it has this big hole into it, to which it is oblivious, right? Because
Yes.
of course, and so the point I'm making is that what is the explanatory power uh, needs to be applied. Needs to be able to be applied to the whole uh, uh, range of
Yes.
human types. Now, of course, if you start from a system that does not include the whole human psychology range, the whole range of human psychology, and you
Mm.
put it together, and it becomes difficult to then somehow make the system. It's easier for the people who are invested into the Enneagram to say, no, uh, this you are wrong. These people that you're talking about, they are not a type that you haven't understood. You are not. These people are actually fit into these Enneagram types. You just
Yep.
haven't
Yep. Yep.
just properly, right? So uh, that, of course, is something that yeah, once the system is put into place, like the Enneagram, it's difficult to make it work. The only way I try to make it to make it fit Socionics for my own
Mm.
interpretation, but I just realized no, actually,
Yep.
it
It
has
needs
this
to be done.
flaw, so I
Yeah.
just
I mean,
stopped to look into it.
I would have said that the problem with Enneagram, the shortcomings in explanatory power, I think actually do stem from a certain lack of its own theoretical integrity.
Mm,
Because it's base three rather than base two, you don't have a function to say, right, I've got this. What is the opposite of that?
mm,
You don't have an opposite if you got three if you're building on base three. So
mm,
that missing quarter at each point they miss that quarter out.
right.
So yeah, the extroverted logic ones are that blind corner on the triangle, which is actually be a square.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a very good way of putting it. Yeah.
And I think that a number of a number of the problems or the shortcomings on the explanatory power of the different typologies can be tracked back to an issue with their internal consistency and coherence. If I look at objective personality, their problem is that they keep on discovering new coins, and each time they do that, they split and split and split and split until you have thousands of different types. And at no point do they then go back and think, okay, if you have this coin and you have this coin, does that necessitate you then having this coin or not? They don't do that. So they have not looked at all at the interrelationships between the coins, which is why they're still using base two, which is good, but it just continues subdividing and subdividing rather than realizing, hang on, certain coin combinations are actually not possible. And
Mm-hmm.
if I mean logically they don't make sense. But because they're not doing that, they say, well, we discovered this coin, we discovered this coin, we discovered this coin, and they lay it, it's like a sandwich all laid out with all its little bits and pieces. And
Mm-hmm.
so you miss the sandwich, you miss the real value of the layering of theory to create an overall effect which has high explanatory power. And you can find issues with almost all the different typologies
Mm-hmm.
by looking at, okay, what is the nature of the structure, and is the nature of the structure sound? But that's of course the introverted logic way of looking at it.
Yeah, no, no, yeah, no, of course, right? No, no, but of course, um, and I would say that in socionics, right, which I of course tend to look at via model A or variations thereof,
Yes.
um, I would say that the structure is sound. It may not be as refined or as sophisticated or as detailed.
Mm,
I think that a difference between maybe our approaches is that maybe, which is understandable, is that uh, I look at the structure that is sound. Maybe it's a bit blurred,
mm,
but since the empirical evidence is also blurred, I for me that's okay. I don't see much point into trying to have, to increase the focus
mm.
because I'm not sure that I'm going to, because I'm not sure if I have the empirical observations validated, while I think you'd prefer to try to, even so, you prefer to try to improve the focus of the model,
Yes. Uh,
even structure, and maybe later try to see if it fits with the
I,
observation.
I would say that my approach is sort of have it, I see it as there's a black box with inputs and there are outputs. And I would say that I am both trying to shape the outputs and the inputs and hoping that they link together in a way which makes sense. Um, for instance, if you look at if we look at mental vital and the assertion by Alshara that this was to do with consciousness, I was thinking, hang on, are we then suggesting that the demonstrator function is not conscious and the vulnerable function is? This is something which, we have both departed from that orthodoxy. And I was thinking to myself, okay, well, empirically it doesn't make sense. We have people we type as being an LSE. They seem to have a consciousness of their extroverted sensation, at least in any way which I would define as conscious. Maybe there's some sort of strange definition which eludes my grasp. But then I think, okay, so if that doesn't work, what else could mental vital be? And then that's when I actually have to look at the outputs and think, okay, what do these different functions, the ones which are classed as mental, what do they all sort of have in common? And what do the vital ones all sort of have in common based on how we see people acting in these different types? And that leads me to offer maybe public private. I was talking about this with Rita as well. And she went, actually, that makes a lot of sense. I plugged that in and into the inputs, and I say that better than explains the relationships with the other parts of the structure. It makes sense that your public interactions, if they are also an area of strength and confidence, that you'd value them, or rather that you, or even that the areas which are you're strong at and you value, you would see as part of your public contribution to the world, and the
Right.
parts of you which you're not good at and you don't value would also be part of your public interaction with the world in terms of what people are expecting and demanding of you. And we can flip that round for the vital, or I say our private functions, for what's strong and not valued. Yeah, you're not going to draw attention to that. That's private.
Hmm.
And you're super rich. So what you value, but you're not good at, you're going to kind of hold that close because it matters to you whether you're good at it or not. And it's an area of personal development. But you
Yeah,
wouldn't want to show that for everyone to judge so much, or at least but you still want to think about it more than other people are demanding of you. So it makes more
yeah,
sense again as being a private area.
yeah. That is very interesting. Maybe we should discuss about it at some point later. I just want to mention now that I had to actually I had forgotten about this whole story about the demonstrative function being unconscious, right?
Mm,
And the vulnerable function being conscious. I think that I think that some people, some of the early socionists, maybe not even Ausha herself, also because uh, the original socionists they had variations of models uh, which maybe avoided this. For instance, one is that one that almost nobody uses. If you remember what I'm saying, the wheel of Kalinowski, remember this,
yes,
right?
yes,
It is very it is, but it's described the same elements, the same types, but I don't think it gets into the whole conscious or unconscious things.
yeah,
I think that what happened is that somebody, I don't even know if it would be Osha herself, I think she also, of course, got into several directions at some point, including Renin dichotomies,
yeah,
is that there was an attempt to make to fit into model A also a Freudian terms, right? As you know, which we still use, right? This is the ego, the super id, the super ego,
yes,
right?
yes,
But you know, I mean, you may correct me if I'm wrong because I'm not really that much into Freudian psychology, but uh, I think he would say that the super id was unconscious, right?
it's hard to I can try
Or
because he
it,
talked about the ego, the id, and the superego. I'm
yes.
not sure if he actually described the super id.
What about the id? Is the id conscious or unconscious?
I don't even know if he called it unconscious. I think he
Yeah,
said it's a part which we look down upon. I guess it. No, no. I think he did project it as being in the lower unconscious part. Most
yeah,
of it was in the unconscious. So yes, he did.
yeah. Then okay. Then of course, then if you consider that the demonstrative and the ignoring are the id, then
Yeah,
if you uh, try to fit a model A into Freudian concepts, they will say they're unconscious. Personally, right?
yeah,
Personally, I never bothered about being
mm,
uh, about this whole idea of conscious or unconscious, right? I mean, okay, I was looking at. I always prefer to focus on on if they are valued or not, or they're strong or not,
yeah,
and also uh, uh, a bit on dimensionality, which I think is useful, but becomes a problem. It tends to be
yes,
problematic if you precisely with the demonstrative function, uh,
yes,
and so. But again, I mean, I think it all shows that these models, although they all reflect observable things, um, they how they fit together maybe is not yet fully the work of making them fit together into a model that's completely coherent and completely explanatory and does not have hidden corners. This work maybe is not yet complete, right? But from
yes. No, I'd say it still definitely is a work in progress. I'll just add to what Freud suggested that it is indeed entirely unconscious,
mm,
but also the ego and the superego are partly unconscious. Although
okay,
the
well,
superego is a bit is it okay, the ego is partly conscious, partly unconscious. The superego is largely unconscious and partly conscious. So it's not that clean divide, which Alshra would should have been led to assume um, from thinking about this.
Yeah, I mean, look, uh, um, maybe the big break, right? Maybe the big
Mm.
break of the early socialists, especially Austria, was really the empirical evidence and the very concept of the 16 of the how the 16 type of the relationship,
Yes,
right?
yes.
And that was the big achievement. And all that came later,
Socion.
yeah, the social, all that came
Yeah.
later was trying to see to improve it, right, and
Mm.
how to make. But I think the problem is, and maybe it is similar to what you said about this coins story.
Yeah.
A lot of the work that was done in daily socionics, whether it was yeah, all of those, a lot of work was done in saying, okay, what about this, what about that, etc. But then very little or nothing was done where somebody says, okay, let's revise it. Okay, this bit here seems to be not very good as anything. So let's forget about it. No, it was all adding up. Actually, it is
Yes.
engineering, as some people call Christmas tree engineering, right? If you know what I mean by that.
I don't know much about. Tell me.
Christmas tree engineering is a term maybe not many people use these days. Is that if you have if you have built, it can even apply to a software even, right? But if you build something, if you build a mechanism, if you build a
Mm.
process, right? Okay, it is working, but it's not working very well.
Yeah.
Uh, but we need to get it working fast. So what do we do? Oh, okay. What about if you add this bit here? And as I said, it can be even it can be a bit in the software, right, as well. But also in real things, also in mechanism or in the chemical process or whatever. Oh, let's put this bit here, and this does solve it, or not completely, or cause a problem here, and then
Mm.
okay, but let's add something on here to make it work, and then you add these things, right, to address specific problems or specific imperfections, because as a
Yeah.
whole the thing does work, but not
Yes.
perfectly. So each time you realize this has a flaw which appears here. Okay, and then you
Yes.
realize
Yes.
that you put a lot of stuff on top of the original concept, right? And then when you look back into it, right, sometimes another person or even yourself, when explain, okay, but why is this bit here, or why is this loop here? Is that still doing something, or has it become irrelevant because of all of the stuff that you put here? Then you say, actually, I don't know, right?
Yep. Yep.
I don't know anymore because I lost track of the whole.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes.
that's and that is sort of, you have the Christmas tree and you put things there, here and there, right? And then you're not sure anymore what of the whole of all of the pieces are still are still really necessary, right?
Yep.
Why
Yep.
was better way of doing it would be to step back and say, okay, let me understand again how this all fits together and what is what, so I can remove what's probably now become redundant and make it be again more efficient or more
Yep.
elegant, at
Yep.
least, right? But sometimes there is no time or opportunity to do that.
It reminds me a lot of the octogenarian with the bucket of pills they have to take every morning. Oh, this one thins my blood. Oh, but this to stop clotting. Oh, but this one has to then yeah, reduce the pumping of my heart so I don't run out of I don't
Oh,
and that treats this and this does that and eventually it connects in the loop. And it's the same sort of idea.
yeah,
I think this leads me back to the third condition of comparing theoretical merits, which is the superfluousness. If you realize that you have two different theoretical constructs in the same theory, basically doing the same thing, and you can get rid of one and it will work better. I think certainly early socionics had that. If you look at Alstra's writings, she places a lot of emphasis on information metabolism and energy metabolism
Yeah.
and the idea of the flow of information. That's not something which we talk about very much in Western socionics. But I'd also say that much of that is explainable separately simply by utilizing the function dichotomies and the information dichotomies.
Mm,
If you understand the functions well, you don't need the map, what I say, the analogy of information flowing around the mental ring and the vital ring.
mm. Right. No, no, I understand. Yeah, I mean, actually, this is. I mean, maybe we should wrap it up soon, but
Yes.
that's another. You mentioned another point, right? In socionics, for instance, that also related to
Mm.
what about work teams. You had these notions about that, which I think it was the uh, ring of supervision was supposed to be the best ring for a work team. Do you remember that?
Yes, yes, I've yes, that I've seen that idea.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know if that is actually is actually uh, is actually validated, right, or is it just being proposed, right, and then it was never really again really checked it, right? But it is an interesting concept. I think when I first
It
saw
is
it,
interesting.
it is counterintuitive,
Mm.
but um, because in my case, for instance, or if you could, if it to be okay, you have ESFJ, uh, ISTP, ENTJ, and INTP. Okay, why exactly would that be a optimized system to work? I suppose it keeps everybody on their toes, right?
Yes,
Um, but is that necessarily the most effective way for work? Maybe it is. I don't know, right? But I just
it sounds precarious because all you
yeah.
need is one to drop out. It's like I've even described the supervision ring as a standoff.
Mm,
I imagine it as a sort of Mexican standoff. In which
right,
case, and Mexican standoffs, they are precarious. All you need is one person to drop out the circle and the guns can start shooting.
right,
So
yeah.
I don't know. I think a good team has a certain amount of resilience built
Mm,
into it, unlike superfluousness in this case. It's the need to change round. And this is why I'd be more inclined to think that having four people of the same quadra is perhaps best in terms of shared values and good complementary strengths. It just means that they'll have a way of doing things which makes it hard for other elements to enter into it from other sets of values.
yeah, but which is why some companies they do have in their culture they do have a predominant quadra, which is something difficult to explain. But I think people
Yes.
do spot it the moment that they enter the company and start
Yes.
working there,
Yes. It
right?
becomes very clear.
Yeah.
Often it's two adjacent quadras, with one being slightly dominant, and then you have a secondary quadra, and then it's the person who's in the third quadra who struggles with the team the most.
Mm. Yeah, that's yeah, that's yeah. I mean, I think yeah. No, I don't. That's yeah. That's a good point, a good way of putting it. Okay. I mean, I see. I don't know how long we've been talking. Maybe we should. Okay.
We should wrap up. I think
Yeah.
the very last thing I want to very briefly touch on is that point in the middle. If I talked about the inputs and the outputs, the
Yeah.
theoretical structure and the empirical outcomes,
Yeah.
I think the part which is the most elusive, but also the part which I think we could and maybe should be thinking about doing some empirical experimentation, is in the existence of the types themselves, not the informational categories, not the information, but the actual types. And I think the underpinning assumption is psychological asymmetry. That if you're good at something, that you're not so good at the opposite of it. Or if you value something, you don't value the opposite of it. And
Uh, I don't know about. I think they're two different concepts, right?
mm,
About being good at something and valuing it, right? I think it
mm,
depends on what you're talking about, because um, I think that you can be good in something that you don't really enjoy or value just by sheer necessity or work or training, etc.
true.
Willpower, um, and I think that. So I think it's now, of
Yeah.
course, you think that okay, if you value something, it's easier for you to focus a lot into it. And it's
Yeah.
easy. That's definitely true, right? But I think that it doesn't mean that you. I think the being good at something is not the best the best
Mm,
validation, the best because okay, I mean
yeah.
sometimes 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 real life examples are useful,
Yeah.
right? And illustrating purpose. For instance, you take the guy who has been called the the greatest actor of this second half of 20th century, Marlon Brando. He actually quote unquote revolutionized acting
Hmm.
in in the theater in his streetcar named Desire. However, he hated acting on stage, which is why he never did after he left. That one was finished, right? It's very
Mm,
different from is very different from actors uh, who, I suppose, to stick to a similar example of Vivian Lee, who say that they feel energized by the audience, right? That they enjoy
yes.
going to when they are on stage, they really feel alive, etc. Right? They really enjoy incarnating another character. They enjoy doing that every night of a month, and they enjoy getting the energy from the audience, right? And this is something
Yes.
Marlon Brando, by our accounts, by on his own, he simply hated. He actually became good at being an actor because he was in a time of his life that he didn't know what else he was going to do in his life, and acting seemed to be a job like any other. And then, okay, he took it from there, right?
Mm,
But he never really enjoyed it, which is why later in his life he only did it in the most mercenary way possible
yep.
to
Yep.
make money. It's different from people like Peter O'Toole who acted until into old age
Yes.
without really needing it. So that's different from that's
Yes.
being good and valuing it, right? So I think the two things can be conflated.
I think yeah, we need to separate out being strong at strength and value anyway, because that would be a requirement for socionics as opposed to
Yes.
Myers-Briggs. But also this is where I go back to what we were discussing before about crystal versus fluid intelligence, I
Yeah.
think. The ability to master a very specific skill that connotatively falls under a particular information metabolism element versus the ability to adapt across a number of different skills under that information element. You take, for instance, I think it's like the skiing champion, who I think Rita was very keen to show us this person. I can't remember her name, who would, at least according to Rita, would actually be an EII, an INFJ. You think, how can an INFJ do this? Well, she practices and practices and practices in that very particular area. She can't do any of the other stuff that you usually associate with extroverted sensation. So what I would suggest is that whichever experiment has to be, it has to use a number, almost a battery of very specific exercises relevant to that particular information metabolism element, with very narrow constraints to force the person to approach it using that particular information metabolism element rather than another one, because there's always room for that to happen. And so it's again the difficulty of you can't measure the information metabolism element directly. You can only measure by proxy the tasks most often associated with it to test the ability to adapt to different situations by processing that require processing that particular kind of information as opposed to another kind of information. So there is complexity to it. It is a tricky one. I think it is possible to design something like this and then have almost four different batteries of tests that our poor overworked participants would have to go through, where what we'd hope to see in terms of hypothesis is if they score highest on, say, the extroverted sensation tasks, that you'd expect them to perform lowest on average across the introverted intuition tasks, and somewhere in the middle on the extroverted intuition and introverted sensation tasks. That would be some kind of starter for a very complicated and probably quite expensive and hard to fund experimental design, because they'd essentially be taking, well, I think four tests is not enough. It has to be a battery, so maybe more like 16 different assessments. So that's a tall order, especially when you need to be testing, I think, hundreds of people. But
Yeah.
I think it could be cracked. I think we could crack open the black box in terms of finding evidence of psychological asymmetry.
No, of course. Yeah. I mean, as I said, there is a big difference between something being clearly possible to
Mm,
find experiment, right? And it
mm,
makes sense. But and there being practical, financial, or whatever limitation.
mm.
Another
Yeah.
one is if you cannot even conceive how to measure it, right? That's a
Yes.
different. When you are when in the second category, I think that's where for me personally, that's why I think it okay. Then there isn't even a point. But of course, if you can conceive it, if it is conceivable, then definitely.
Yes. How would you measure different tasks relevant solely to introverted intuition?
Um, I think it's very difficult to isolate that from other concepts, like, for instance, like intelligence.
Mm,
Um, and so one would have to analyze all of the different factors, right?
yeah.
And try to isolate them, right? And again go back to finding the signal in the noise. Um, However, right, it to always, however, they are already seeing a problem because, for instance, there are some people who are inclined to be writers
Yes.
who uh, they easily go into writing or thinking about stories and stories or movie scripts or whatever to call it spontaneously, right? So they are never out of ideas to write because they're constantly thinking about this. I don't have any musical talent whatsoever, but I would imagine that for people who are inclined to music, right, people who are composers, people to go to an extreme example, which is Mozart, right? Such people, I would imagine, they also have in their minds building only instead of the written word, they are building a musical word, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
This, this would be similar in actually one could even argue that one would be introverted intuition coupled with extroverted thinking, and the
Mm.
other one would be introverted intuition coupled with extroverted thinking,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And so and maybe if we can validate, okay, that is a difference, then we can we try to compare, okay, how much people are focused on introverted feeling with intuition and others with thinking, right? Now, if assuming that you have
Mm.
access to an unlimited number of people, right? Then it will be possible to try to extract that. But again, I mean, I think that on the other hand, I mean, our day-to-day experience already shows the difference between the people who are inclined to write books in their heads and people who are inclined to try music. So we are basically validating something that we can already see that is there, although it's more difficult to actually quantify it
Yes.
in this way, right? So I suppose, again, going back to my original cuneiform analogy, I suppose if people can see it, right, I think you can't unsee it. And if you don't see it, okay, then it becomes more difficult, right? Now how to put it into a way that is so make it so clear and so obvious that everybody can see it. Uh, yeah, I mean, that I think that's essentially what you're talking about. But that's of course, I don't know. I don't have, of course. Uh, uh, yeah, I cannot put together a precise procedure how to do
Sure,
it. I
sure,
to have some ideas and see where to go, but not how
sure.
to put it together.
It's an important point you raise. It is one which I think also would lead one more towards Kimani White and his work on Model L, which is very much treats the elements as already blocked together in terms
Mm.
of introversion with logic, introversion with ethics, and I think maybe that could be a way of making any sort of assessments more robust. Who knows? Hmm.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. I'm getting a bit tired, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Let's wrap it up. Peter, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jack. I enjoyed it very much.
Me
We, should, we,
too.
we have to do it again.
Yes, please. Yes,
All
please.
right.
Maybe sometime next month. Let's find another topic.
Okay, that's great.
All right. Speak soon.
Okay, then. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.